Now this is a pretty crude drawing of a snowmobile, but you can see some of the features. Rear suspension, front suspension, you have where the tunnel meets, there's a seat. Rider placement would be roughly right around here. So you have a rear shock, a center shock, and then just for illustration, you've got a ski shock. Most of the tuning that you're going to be doing on your suspension comes down to one thing, which makes it kind of simple. It's going to be spring rate. The reason spring rate is so important is because it does dictate ride heights. Ride heights control the way that the sled transfers weight, and this is how I'm going to explain it. Every sled has a center of gravity, and we're going to just call it that point right now. Center of gravity has 3 different axes to it, but the only one that we're going to be concerned about right now is this vertical axis to center of gravity. This is the point where all of the weight on the machine is equal from front to back. 50% of your weight is here, 50% of your weight is here. This position of center of gravity only matters when the sled is in air, if you're jumping, because this is what's going to cause the sled to tip one way or the other. When the sled hits the ground, that point is no longer relative, and the point that matters is center of transfer. Center of transfer is a position that can be tuned, which is what dictates the way that the sled handles. If your center of transfer is here, the rear suspension is going to be light and the front suspension is going to be heavy. If your center of transfer is here, your rear suspension is going to be heavy and your front suspension is going to be light. What we want to do with ride heights and suspension setup is we want to align the best way we can the center of transfer and the center of gravity. The way that we're going to demonstrate how sleds transfer weight is we're going to put the sled on scales. When we put the sled on scales, you're going to see where all of the weights are going. Now there's 4 major components to a sled, and we're going to have a scale underneath each one of those components. We're going to have a scale underneath here, which is the center shock. We're going to have a scale underneath the rear arm. And we're going to have a scale underneath each ski. Those 4 points are going to tell us where the weight's transferred. Once we have the weight transferring the way that we want, we're going to put a rider on the sled. With the rider on the sled, we're going to understand how that sled accommodates the rider weight, where that weight transfers. When the rider sits down on the seat, if that rider's 200 pounds, we want to know of that 200 pounds, how much of it is going to each ski, how much of it's going to the center shock, and how much of it is going to the rear shock. The way that these weights transfer dictate rider input. If you move forward on the machine, how is it going to affect the way that the sled transfers weight to the skis? If you move back on the machine or side to side, all of this comes into play whether you're on trail, going across bumps, or if you're in the mountains, you're doing side hilling, downhill turns. This is the math and the science behind the way that sleds really handle. So we now have this sled on scales, and you can see there's a scale underneath each ski. If you walk around this side, you can see we have a scale underneath the rear arm and the center shock. Now these scales are going to give us numbers on what we're seeing with the weights of this sled without a rider on them. Now the good thing about this setup right here is that the combined weight of each scale is going to be the weight of the sled. And we're going to understand how much of that weight, as a total weight, is divided in percentages between each point. All right, so what I've done here is I've kind of just listed some of the numbers that we pulled off the scales. And we're just going to go over them and try to make sense of what's actually happening on the sled. Now, I know what the air pressures are on that machine right now because it's been tuned for the rider that was riding it and for the way that the sled is right now with the track and the turbo and everything else. But you can see right here, there's a little bit of a difference between left and right ski as far as weights go. Now that's only going to come more into play when we put a rider on the sled. We're going to see how those numbers change. When you put a rider on the sled, that might equalize because you're loading the suspension a little bit differently. So we're not really worried about this yet. The center shock, you can see, barely had any weight to it. The rear shock carried most of it without a rider, which gives us a total weight of 530 pounds, a front ski weight combined of 290 pounds, and a rear suspension weight of 240. Now, we've graphed it out in a percentage of front to back without the rider. NR is no rider, WR is with rider. And we're gonna see what this does when we put a rider on there. So 55% of the weight right now is on the front, 45% of the weight is on the back, which basically tells us that where a rider position is, center transfer is slightly forward. When we put a rider on here, the suspension might carry the weight completely different, and it's going to move that center of transfer. We're mainly only concerned about the weights with the rider on the sled because typically the rider's always going to be on the sled while the sled is in motion. So I'm sitting on the machine in a very neutral position, kind of normally about where I would be riding the sled. Now my rider weight is 200 pounds, so roughly about 195. And that's going to come into play when we see how these scales distribute the weight. Center of gravity on a machine is roughly at or just before the handlebars. So I'm going to be a little bit behind center of gravity, and we're going to see where that center of transfer ends up. And hopefully it's just in front of me, and we're going to get that 50-50, 45-55 weight distribution. Okay, so you can see we have our new ski weights, and you can see how they've changed, equalized a little bit when I got on the machine. The center shock went up to 200. The rear shock went down to 215. Now, this is telling us a lot about how the sled is distributing weight. Final number 728, so that's almost the 200 pounds of my rider weight. The front combined is carrying 313 of that, and the rear suspension is carrying 415 of that, with a final percentage distribution of 43% with rider to the front suspension, 57% to the back. Now, this is a little bit of a heavy transfer to the rear suspension, but we want the rear suspension to carry most of the weight. We want the front suspension to be unloaded. This 150 pounds per ski range is exactly where we want to be. We don't want to see weights higher than that at the ski. And the reason for that is because everything that's weighted to the ski is going to be something that you feel through the handlebars. Especially in the mountains, if you're side hilling and that ski is loaded, these are the weights when you're neutral on the machine. If you're standing on one side, on the slope side, and you're opposite foot forward, there's going to be much higher weights on that inside ski. And depending on what that is, it'll make it hard to countersteer. It'll make it hard to move the front of the sled when you need to. So 150 pounds, just from experience, is really a target number for us, which is one of the reasons that the Pro RMK is such a well-balanced machine and works so good in the mountains. Now, the center shock you see at 200 pounds and the rear shock at 215. The rear suspension is carrying that weight very evenly. And these are very good numbers. Right now, what we have in the rear and the center shock of the rear suspension is the Chris Brandt series Fox kit. So in the main chamber, we're running 120 PSI, we're running 180 in the Evol, and our center shock is 60 PSI. This is very, very good for about a 200 pound rider. The ski shocks right now, we have 80 PSI in the main, which is a little bit high, very good for spring riding. And we have 165 PSI in the Evol. Right now we have a very good suspension setup, something that would feel very good on snow. But this might not be the case, and you're probably not going to have scales to see all of this laid out like that. So how do you tune your sled to get these type of results? And that's what we're going to talk about now. If you're feeling like the suspension is very heavy at the front end, and we've seen numbers here on certain chassis well over 200 pounds with rider on, the 220 range. These are this is the heavy steering. You know, this is gonna be something that feels like, you know, going down the trail, the rear end is unloaded and it's very squirrely, it's very unpredictable. You go over bumps and it feels like the machine is riding you. That's why right there, because the numbers are way too high in the front. You're gonna carry at least an extra 100 to 150 pounds of weight at the skis, and it's just not manageable. So how do we get that number to go down? How do we transfer that weight to the rear and move this center of transfer closer towards the center of gravity? The best way that we can do that is with ride heights. If you lower the ride height of your front suspension, it's like a teeter-totter. If this goes down on this end, the weight is going to load to the low side. If this goes up, the weight is going to load to the rear. So in order to pull weight from the front suspension, we're going to drop the ride height of the rear and we're going to raise the ride height of the front. We're going to increase the spring rate here and we're going to decrease the spring rates here. Now, in order to properly do this, you need shocks that are going to be valved for these type of changes. And in 2015, we are going to be offering rear suspension packages for every mountain chassis out there that have valving codes that allow you to make these type of changes and improve the handling.